Hey everyone, welcome to Outside Ourselves, a podcast featuring conversations that remind us faith isn't something we do, it's something we receive. Welcome to our first ever episode. I'm so excited today that I'm getting to chat with my friend David Zahl about his newest book, Low Anthropology, The Unlikely Key to a Gracious View of Others and Yourself. Dave is not only an amazing writer and speaker, he is the founder and director of Mockingbird Ministries. He is both theologian and cultural expert who is amazing and super adept at uncovering the surprising ways that grace shows up in our everyday lives. Today we're talking about all things low anthropology, which really just means that we're talking about Christian anthropology. I don't think we mention it because we recorded this episode a few weeks ago, but Dave's book is actually out now. So if you would like to order it, you can do so right now as you listen to the show or afterwards. I definitely think once you hear what he has to say, you're going to want to hear more. So please make sure to check that out. All right, here's the show. Dave, thanks so much for, I want to say being here, but I don't really know where here is. So thanks for chatting today. Super excited to talk to you about everything that's coming up for you and stuff that's going on at Mockingbird.
Oh, thanks, Kelsi. It's fun to be here, wherever.
Yeah.
Awash in the zeros and ones.
Exactly. Well, for people who don't know, you have a book coming out next week. I don't know when this is going to be released. Probably your book will be out by the time we get this out, but I'm really excited to talk about it. I read the whole thing and it's awesome. I think it's super accessible for any Christian from any background, but also non-Christians. I think really anyone could pick it up and kind of learn something. So tell us a little bit about the book and why you decided to write it.
Sure. Well, the book's title is Low Anthropology, The Unlikely Key to a Gracious View of Others, and then in parentheses, and yourself. And so I wrote it for a couple different reasons. And I've just finished actually writing a piece about why I wrote it. So I feel like I've got the language here.
Good.
First of all, I wrote it because I am like a person in the world like anyone else. And the experience of life in 2022 often feels like you're just trudging when you're not sort of with your family and your immediate friends and your contacts, but like the second you sort of look outside, you poke your head out of the parapet, it feels like kind of a sea of acrimony and blame and sort of just bad feeling and or just in a super intense pace of life that we're all trying to barrel down. And trying to make sense of this this kind of what life has become for many of us, which I think is a huge burden. I don't think life is ever easy, but I was reflecting for several years on what kind of cultural conditions or what sort of contributes to that feeling that I'm the only one who's struggling. Everyone else seems to have it together. I'm the only one who's got problems. I'm the only Christian who's sort of dealing with besetting problems in my own life. And I came to the conclusion that at least in large part, it's a problem of our sort of view of human nature, that we have swallowed a really superficial view of human nature. And that it's a view of human nature that kind of breaks people down into categories of us versus them. It's a view of human nature that is sort of, it promotes like fantasies about what people are capable of and about what their limits are or lack thereof.
Yeah.
And it ends up fueling a whole lot of burnout and loneliness and exhaustion, division, all these things. And so I call that high anthropology, a view of human nature that's too optimistic. And the strange thing about an optimistic view of human nature is that instead of it promoting sort of good self-esteem and flourishing and all that stuff, what it does is it actually produces shame and hiding and, kind of a real sense of despair. Like there's that You've been sold a false bill of goods about what you're capable of, what other people are capable of, and of course, what God owes you, or something like that. So that was one of the reasons why I wrote the book. I think that Low Anthropology, and by that is really just like a biblically derived, or sort of the resources that Christians have to draw on when it comes to telling us who we are, what we're capable of, what it's like to be a sinner, what it's like to be broken, what it's like to be made in the image of God. All of these things, I think we have tremendous resources to draw on. And I wanted to make those resources accessible in as broad a way as I possibly could. The other reason, Kelsi, and like this is probably the deeper reason, is so I work at a church, and I would say a couple times every month, we have someone who comes into the office who's found their way to church. They almost are like surprised that they're there. They're like, what am I doing here? Because they either are disinterested in Christianity, they find it irrelevant, or they have a sort of an active antipathy towards organized religion, right? And yet life has brought them to a place where they're interested in God, or they're interested in forgiveness or grace or something like that. And they come in and they're usually going through some kind of crisis. Occasionally it's just like a spiritual awakening. And they meet with one of the clergy, and they, you can tell, like, they want to know more. They're like genuinely like, okay, I'm going to give this a shot.
Yeah.
And then I watch, and I'm sometimes the person they're visiting with, but most of the time it's someone else. And the inclination is not to want to leave them empty-handed, like them to leave empty-handed. It's like, here's a book for you to read, or here's something that might help you. Of course, the answer is always, read the Bible. But I've just found over the years, like, I have less and less of these books that are sort of like give to anyone, that make sense of the Christian faith to someone who is unfamiliar with it. Most books like that are just loaded with Christianese, or in our in our kind of vernacular, Kelsi, it's just nothing but law. Well, so I've been needing a book like this, and so I was like, screw it, I'm going to write it myself, or I'm going to try. It's not going to be as good as other people's, but I also found, like, I've dealt with college students for a lot over the years, and there's certain books that Mockingbird's published, or even 1517's published, or even these people that I consider to be so playful and interesting, someone like Robert Capon, like, they read it and they don't, it's it's seminary level almost. And so I've wanted something to be able to give them that sort of gut level, and that they can get something from. And I mean, I want to make the Christian faith, if not compelling, well, at least intelligible to people. So that's why I wrote the book.
The great answer. I mean, I think it is that, for sure. Like, I think that makes total sense, thinking about giving it to someone who's just interested in faith. And I think you talked about, like, the idea of low anthropology is a biblically based idea, but it's also rooted in reality. It's rooted in the fact that we live it every day, even if we are kind of unaware of how it's playing out. So I think that's so helpful for people. How do you see, like, when people first are introduced with this idea of low anthropology, if you're, talking to someone that's coming into church for the first time, or maybe even a Christian, like a lifelong Christian that just has no understanding of what that means, what tends to be the reaction? Is there kind of one reaction you've observed that people have, or is it kind of all over the board?
That's a great question. What I would say is, I noticed that there are diverging reactions depending on the upbringing and the baggage that someone would have. So what I've found to be true is that people that were brought up in a kind of a very, you might even say legalistic, or just heavily capital E evangelical type of Christianity, an American version, they have often been confronted with an anthropology, an understanding of human nature, that they think makes them feel bad about themselves. And Christianity they see as an engine, if they've had a bad experience of it. I see the fallout of sort of oppressive forms of religion, as a Christian religion, almost always have to do with a very, very heavy use of the law without the gospel. So there's a sense in which they are told constantly how much they suck, or how bad they are, how short they fall. And yet there's when they become a Christian, they keep hearing about, for non-Christians, it's like, hey, you've fallen short, you need forgiveness, here's God's forgiveness. And they watch as people get excited and become Christians. But then for the Christian, there's this, what I would call selectively high anthropology. They become a Christian, and then they're given this whole new burden of things they need to do. And so if that's been your experience of Christianity, you'll hear stuff about low anthropology, say, oh, that sounds like shame. That sounds like self-loathing. When in my experience, shame and self-loathing are actually the product of a high anthropology. What I mean is that you were told that as if you're a Christian, then you can fulfill the law, and yet you don't seem to be able to. And that creates shame. Whereas before you were non-Christian, you needed God's help. Now it's sort of up to you. And if you don't say that outwardly, it's sort of what's communicated implicitly. And so there's a selectively high anthropology that comes about. The way I talk about it in the book is that it's not defeating to say that you and I are incapable of ever fully getting our act together. What is defeating and shame-inducing is the idea that we just haven't been able to pull it off yet.
Right. Yeah.
So there's that group of people that I think are often drawn to the parts of low anthropology that say weakness is more definitive than strength. That say it's okay to be vulnerable. This buzzword about vulnerability in our culture is usually a way of people talking about low anthropology while sucking it out,
without naming it,
or taking any kind of moral valence out of the equation.
Yeah, that makes sense.
But if you're if you're actually, the situation I grew up in, Kelsi, was not that. I grew up in the East Coast, what now known as sort of coastal elitism, and then was just known as like preppy private school life of high achieved type A sort of Ivy League people. Yeah. And that's not a comment on my own capabilities. It's just sort of the air I breathed. And that was sort of like, you're special, you're amazing. Anyone who doesn't realize that has got a problem. You're kind of God's gift. It's the word we use today is entitlement. Yeah. And so I've found, to people who grew up in that kind of perfectionistic era or atmosphere, when they hear about low anthropology, the notion that we are limited in what we can know, limited in what we can do, that we are all conflicted and not simple-minded. We have all sorts of competing motivations that are often opaque to us. And that thirdly, there's an ineluctable dark side of human nature that expresses itself in sort of self-centeredness and kind of the imp of the perverse. They often hear that and be like, oh, someone's finally telling the truth. Like, I know this to be true. I'm not the only one. You hear a real unburdening. So I do find that the reaction varies.
That makes total sense. I think I probably personally tend to feel or be in the second camp of it. I think for me, like finally understanding or being introduced to law gospel theology, low anthropology, all of these ideas was kind of this unburdening of like, okay, I don't have it all together, and neither does anybody else. And it was kind of like a huge relief and a comfort. I think that's a thing that it can be for a lot of people, is a comfort in the sense that they're not alone.
You're not alone. And people feel so alone. And people feel like, or they think that people don't struggle the same way they do. And that's just a fiction. But it's like one of the greatest fictions we all deal with. It's a fiction within the church. It's a fiction outside of the church. It's really debilitating.
You kind of go through these different aspects of low anthropology. And I'm curious if you've seen people struggle with one of those more than others. I think for me, the idea of doubleness, even as a Christian, was really hard to understand. That's one of the aspects that you talk about. But I don't know. I don't know if there's there's one that you've kind of seen people.
No, doubleness is the hardest.
Yeah.
And doubleness
Yeah.
is the one I tried to have a new word for. Doubleness is another word for inner conflict or conflictedness. The Romans 7 experience of life of I know the good I should do, but it's the evil I don't want to do that I keep on doing. That doubleness makes sense of why people don't just act the way they say they want to act or aren't. You can't just tell someone what they should do or think and they'll do it. There's an enormous amount of internal resistance or weather. And it's not always moral. It can just be like, don't press that red button. And all of a sudden I want to press that red button,
Yeah.
But the experience of addiction is usually what reveals our doubleness the most. Doubleness in Christian terms, I'm talking about agency, not about capability. So the problem is not, is that I have competing. I'm sort of an underdog in it's like Inside Out, the movie Pixar. It's like that view of life, which I think is actually true to life, and that I'm never just one thing and not another. I can know what the right thing to do is, but that doesn't necessarily mean I'm going to do it. So doubleness is like it's usually a point of pain. Like I can do what I should or what I want to do in most cases, but the places where I find that difficult is usually going to be the part of my life that's painful.
Yeah. And I mean, I'm even thinking like shameful. Like that's probably where a lot of people's shame comes from.
Yes. So doubleness is very difficult, and it runs deeply against the grain of a kind of a modern understanding of the human beings as being sort of captains of their own ships. And I just need to tell you what to do and you'll do it. That is a very kind of a modern American or just Western idea that's simply not true and never has been true. And Augustine knew that, and Paul knew that, and Jesus knew that. And if you want to love people, if you have any desire to pastor them or care for them, or yourself, you have to understand this truth that we are like a jumble of competing forces, and it's not that clear cut. And also, by the way, under the heading of because doubleness is usually about motivation, that people are emotional creatures, that we're not intellectual creatures. We have intellectual capacity. I think one of the phrases that I use in there is that reason is confirmatory, not exploratory. So we use our intelligence to sort of justify what we already think or what our intuition tells us. And that's what social scientists have been saying this forever. I think the Bible said it better. Paul did, and he was but I haven't found enough Christians sort of connecting those dots. And so I was like, I guess I should do this. The bondage of the will is how Luther talks about it. It doesn't mean we don't have a will. I can choose between, black socks and green socks, but I can't choose to feel a certain way about my socks. I can't choose to love a person I don't love. I can choose to not be mean to. I can act in a certain way that's not mean to them, but I cannot force myself to feel something.
We tend to assume we personally operate intellectually, like we're above emotions, and yet everyone else around us is making these quick, rash, emotional judgments, and we don't understand why. Like I feel like there's some conflict there where I don't know. Like when I thinking if I get upset about something with politics or what's going on, it's always like, well, I know better. Why do they not know better? And I cannot. It's not until I realize we're both parties, myself and the other people involved, are just making an emotional decision.
or they have emotional reasons, and maybe some of them are more valid. I don't know, but you're totally
Yeah.
right about
Yeah.
that. It's and there are certain places where we're not conflicted, where we feel, but like the stuff of where our life plays out is usually the place where we're like, I know I should love this person. I know I should forgive my parents. You know, what is it always? It's like, I just can't forgive myself. Like, you cannot force yourself to do that. You know, it's
Yeah.
these are unmanageable. This is the unmanageable part of reality. So yeah,
Yeah.
doubleness is not flattering. And we always think that if other people were just more like us and could see it the way we do, then we'd be great. But you know, you just have to talk to the person you live with, and they'll know the place. Like, well, okay, this might not get under your skin, the way that such and such happens, but like, let's see how you act when you're, you know, with your parents who you haven't seen for however long, you know?
Can you kind of talk to us about, I think you say pretty bluntly, forgiveness is the solution. It solves the problem of, you're laying out like sin, but then also the way we tend to minimize it or we tend to avoid it. Can you talk to us a little bit about how forgiveness is that solution?
Yeah, the book is constructed so that it gets progressively like more intense, as I said. And like, usually the way doubleness is addressed in people's lives is like a new desire supplants an old one, right? Like, it's, you know, you stop playing that video game because a new one comes out that you like more, you know, or you fall in love and you want to be with this person more than you care about the video game. Self-centeredness, the way that is the only real way to deal with the fallout of sin, and which is, it's sort of a euphemism. Self-centeredness is my euphemism for sin. Is through reconciliation and forgiveness. So, yeah, I think that one of the ways we deal with sort of misbehavior today is we try to get behind it and minimize it by figuring out what people's motives were. And, well, if you knew what their childhood was like, well, then you would have empathy, and then you would realize they couldn't help it, and therefore they don't really need forgiveness. They just need patience, you know? Or we deny it and we sort of act like, you know, what I did wasn't that bad. But I think what Christianity, the Jesus does in his parables, and is sort of to say, actually, no, there is such a thing as malicious intent, and if we're honest with ourselves, we are more out. Our motives are more mixed, and we did do something with intent more often than we can imagine, and what we need is not for the king to shrink our debt. We need the king to absorb our debt. And that's why he talks, I think, in those, the parables of the unjust steward is the one I use in the book, or I look at in the book. But I think there's something fundamental about payment that, you know, Kelsi, I was talking about this. We were on the Mockingcast, the podcast I do. We were talking about South Africa in the year since 1994, since apartheid was destroyed or dismantled. And what this writer Eve Fairbanks notes is that these white South Africans, Afrikaners, especially those who worked hardest to dismantle apartheid, are deeply sad. Like, they're having a hard time in life, even though their lives are going well. Like, economically, they're fine. She picked up on this deep sort of ennui or sadness, and she quotes this guy who's been like, who this widespread feeling that they got off too easy, like that white people basically got off too easy for apartheid, and that they're almost like the black South Africans are like shoving their face in it by not forcing them to pay more. And they want to pay more. They're like, give me something more to do. I need to, I think the line says, the Bible is right about one thing. It is infinitely more difficult to receive than to give, especially if the gift is mercy. And you have these people dying to be able to atone, because they're well aware that they're even if there were reasons galore for why apartheid came into being, ultimately it's seen as evil, you know. And what do you do with evil and that kind of will to power, that domination? Like, well, forgiveness is the only real thing that can be done.
That's super interesting because it's like, it seems to me like people, and I don't know if this is just true of our day and age or across time, but people can come to this understanding that what they did was wrong, whether it's one act or, that they are limited, that there are bad parts of them. But yeah, this idea that they are not the solution, or the reality that they are not the solution to that, that there's nothing they can do to get out of it, is, I think, what trips a lot of people up. It trips me up. Because I always, I have a bad, even this last week, we had some childcare issues, and then our power went out, and immediately I'm like, okay, what do I need to do I need to get my ducks in a row, and I need to make this better. Which there's some practicality to that, but it's me figuring out how to get myself out of the mess. I think we just operate that way naturally.
It's much more comfortable if I can be the one to arrange it or to contribute, because then it can be like, I feel I've contributed enough. We don't want to be told. It's just unfair to be told that you this has been settled on your behalf and there's nothing really you can do about it. You're like, I want to suffer. I feel like there's some injustice that needs to be covered here. Maybe not with childcare, but I know what you're talking about, though. It's a very common refrain today. I so-and-so forgave me, but I can't forgive myself. That not only highlights the sort of doubleness aspect of I know I should, or I know they've told me they forgive me, but I also know that the emotional reality is that forgiveness sometimes feels impossible and you can certainly not generate it on your own steam.
Yeah.
We much more for payment and forgiveness are different things. It's not like.
Yeah. I think that is such a crucial distinction that we miss so much. We think we operate as if they're completely the same thing.
Yeah, it's really hard to find allegories or even metaphors that can do this justice, because forgiveness is such a miracle. And again, the miracle, one of the things I try to convey in this book, Kelsi, is that it's what's so great. The great miracle is that given what our state, the fact that so many beautiful and wonderful things happen is really a shock, and it's wonderful.
Yeah.
It's awe-inducing. It's the combination between expecting the best versus expecting the worst. And I'm not trying to validate pessimism, but I do think that, in fact, a more optimistic view of the world and human nature sets people up for bitterness, because life just turns out to be life. And but if you have a low anthropology, really does open a person up not only to needing help from the outside and needing to be loved, but you also get to say, oh my goodness, the fact that so many wonderful things happen at all is such a miracle, and it's such evidence that we're not living in a meaningless world, or we get what we deserve kind of Breaking Bad kind of world.
Yeah, that's the surprise in our world. It's not sin and resistance. It's these acts of grace when we see them, wherever we see them.
Yeah. And we do see them.
Yeah, all the time. I want to shift gears a little bit. I feel like we've kind of danced around this, but you're basically, what you're getting people to is, if you have this view of low anthropology, you're able to be more gracious to yourself, or know that grace is given to you, and then also offer grace to those around you, knowing they are dealing with these same things that you are. Is there a difference between making excuses for people and that and those limits, or that sin, and dealing with them graciously? Is there a line? How do we kind of know the difference, or is there a difference? Maybe there's not that big of a difference.
No, I don't know. I think there's like a way to just, sometimes people will hear this book and they'll think like, well, nobody's perfect, so whatever, why bother? Or like, it's okay. You can't really be certain about anything. So why even try to be certain about like I say, low anthropology isn't there to dissolve injustices or real convictions. It's more just like a default humility when it comes to dealing with people in those situations. So I don't really know the answer to how. Well, let me say this. I don't, although the book has a sort of a slightly self-helpy subtitle, which is just sort of, unavoidable if you actually want to sell a book.
Yeah.
The real gift of a low anthropology is not just recalibrating expectations of other people or yourself. Those things are great, and that can be helpful for a season. Or patience with people who are doubled in all sorts of ways and tied in knots. That can be good too. But the real gift of a low anthropology is not some sort of new perspective or adjusted lens or even knowledge. The real gift of a low anthropology is it allows, it's a view of human beings that looks to God. God is the hope, not my better perspective or my new mindset. And so without a high anthropology basically says, God, I might need occasional hand from, a helping hand, or maybe God needs me to partner meaningfully with God in the world or something like that. But low anthropology says, actually, I need God to live, and not die. I need God for deliverance, for salvation, to save me from death. And so I don't want to while there is all sorts of fruit of low anthropology, and I try to make that clear because people are so allergic to the idea that human beings are less than or not as noble as we're the sum of both our best and our worst, and we like to think of human beings are just sort of their best moments. I don't want to suggest that while there are plenty of fruit, curiosity I talk about. If you can never, if by definition you can never know everything, well, then you can remain curious about things and be interested in what your spouse has to say, even if you think you know what they're going to say. You pursue friendships because you cannot. There's no such thing as a lone wolf in life. No one can make it on their own. So there are all these fruit, but the real fruit is faith, because the person who is incomplete in of themselves and cannot save themselves needs a savior. So that's the book is a quote unquote pre-evangelistic in that respect. But again, like, it's not hidden. Like I say, I'm a Christian, and like I find that people don't understand Christianity if they don't understand human beings are in need of more than just help, but like salvation.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, that I read this. I think it was on his newsletter. This piece from David French this weekend he was writing about the difference between Lord of the Rings and Game of Thrones, because those have both come out, and he's talking about what in particular Tolkien and Lord of the Rings gives us that is kind of missing from today's world. And it's this hope that you're talking about. To me, it's the solution that, again, we've been talking about all day, the solution to our low anthropology. Because I think like Game of Thrones is an amazing show and does a really amazing thing in maybe revealing that low anthropology, or revealing that everyone has these dark parts of them, but it doesn't really offer much of a solution.
100%. And I couldn't agree more. Like I loved that piece. I know what you're talking about, and I think that Tolkien I take him 9 days out of the week over George R. R. Martin, and I still like this. I like the intrigue and I like this stuff, but there's nothing. It's unremitting in sort of. It's like this is all there is. And in Tolkien, there is such a thing as good, and it does have a force of its own. I mean, I don't want to get into the theology of these things, but I do find it to be refreshing because it holds out hope of deliverance and kind of, there being a will behind the universe that you see kind of through the gods and stuff like that you just don't have in. It's much more Machiavellian in.
It's just what's funny is they're at the end of Game of Thrones, the original series, they came out with a song and a music video that we watched for some reason on, I can't remember who's in it, but the song is called Power is Power. And it's kind of true. Like, it's just that is Game of Thrones. It's like, it's this power is power circular wheel that they're going around, and there's just no escape from it. And that's, I think, back to that David French piece, that's kind of exactly what he's talking about, is power is not the only thing that we should be striving for. And Tolkien does such a good job of showing us that. So,
but it requires, Kelsi, don't you think it requires an enormous amount of energy to constantly keep up this idea? One of the things that Game of Thrones does do is in revealing and saying, okay, the people that are supposedly the unassailable good and the unassailable bad actually have a lot more in common than we think. Like, what Martin does is he basically says, even though those who you think are good have bad tendencies, and are fallible. What Tolkien would do is would say, or I think a more Christian view would be to say, even those who are totally broken and totally reprehensible are capable of works of great beauty. And that's what our like we talk about it in terms of like today the debates around cancel culture or art that is deemed an artist makes a mistake, does something terrible maybe, or comes out as some sort of terrible racist or hate monger. And then you have to say, well, therefore none of their work is it's all tainted by this evil. And what you might even say, well, perhaps, but you could also say that, like, isn't it beautiful that the best part of them, or like that even terrible people are capable of acts of great beauty. Like that's the flip side of saying that good people are capable of acts of terrible self-interest. So I think there's a relief to dropping the pretense that I have it more together than I think, or that I'm more capable or less self-centered than I am. There's a real relief to that, and it takes a lot of energy to prop that up, especially because it allows us to that belief allows us to vilify other people so terribly.
Well, it's just a constant. It's the energy comes from constantly weighing and measuring and counting where you are on the scale of good and bad, because you're hoping the scales tip in the favor of good for yourself. And I think that's a really good point of it just doesn't work that way. God doesn't work in as you talked about the parable of the unjust servant. He doesn't work in bookkeeping. So that's not even a frame in which, of course, that's how the world is playing out, but that's not how he's looking at things. There's, I think, a trend lately, I don't know if it's just lately, but kind of this language of like celebration of life, and always propping up those who have died as only good. And I think there's something that's good and hopeful to that, probably within grief, of remembering how people are good, remembering their best parts. But is that, I don't know, I'm curious if you think, what you think about maybe even just specifically like the language of funerals and remembrances after people have gone. Is it helpful to view people in light of their best motives? or is there another way to do it? I don't know. I feel like there was something at the end of the book where you're talking about funerals and death, but
Yeah, there is.
I'm making that up.
I quote an obituary by a Lutheran guy actually who wrote his own obituary.
Okay.
And
that's right. Okay.
He sort of trots out. It's very self-deprecating. It's unbelievably self-deprecating,
Yeah.
and he talks about his accomplishments. But what comes across is the gratitude, and he didn't take himself that seriously, and he was grateful to God and to his church for sort of helping him. And he's able, therefore, there's a freedom to him that he's allowed to sort of make jokes about how he, always chose the money over integrity, and stuff like that. But then he credits God with, keeping him sober from gambling. And it's a very, very powerful instance of, I think, if you go to a funeral, the outward public figure that people sort of need to remember is usually they talk about their best moments and their positive attributes and their greatest accomplishments. And there's truth to that. But if you go to the people that really love those, that knew them and loved them, they'll tell stories that'll make you laugh about that person. Do you remember when so-and-so got pulled over and talked his way out of that thing and we all knew he was drunk or so, whatever it is, there'll be some sort of falling on the face or some kind of chink in the armor that solidified those bonds. And that for them in that moment is not evidence of their shortcomings, but evidence of their humanity. And like they start crying. Sure, they might start crying thinking about the sort of selfless acts that this person did. But when you're dealing with a deep loss, you're dealing with the loss of someone who is real, who you knew at their best and their worst. And most of the sort of deeply loving tributes you find are not hagiography. They're not worship of the person. They are, I miss this person because this person, we knew each other. And we were in it together, and somehow we survived. And without them putting up with me when I was such and such, I would never have gotten through. And so it's bathed. Real love is just bathed in like the chinks in the armor, the weaknesses, the vulnerabilities, and yes, even sin. It doesn't excuse the sin, but it means redemption occurs at the point of failure, not mutual admiration society. You know what I mean?
Thank you. That is a super helpful clarification, I think. Is there anything like, as you were writing this, that kind of surprised you?
I find that it's very hard to talk to people about the human condition in a way that's honest and truthful, but that doesn't sort of push the wrong buttons. And by that, I mean, doesn't shut people down. And the word today is trigger their shame or their, the no that they heard from a parent or from a pastor or something like that. And so I sometimes feels like it's a dance you do, to find just the right examples, just the right words. But I've also, it's surprising, I also find that very few people, when you get down to it, are resistant to Low Anthropology, because it's true. Like, it's just true. And it's always a relief to deal with what's true. And I think truth is where God resides. So it's not like we're not left there to our own devices, a la Jon Snow. The other thing I would say is, like, I had to deal with it in terms of my own life. And so I have a section in there on depression, and that was some fresh thoughts for me, because I've always felt like to be depressed is evidence of low anthropology, meaning people are saddled with conditions that they don't choose and sort of affect them in all sorts of ways. But what I realized was, for me, the actual experience of depression is a high anthropology thing, because I get into the state where I feel hopeless about the future, and there's a complete dark. The horizon is completely dark. I don't see, like, for me, the experience of depression is like I'm trapped. There's no way out, everything is downhill from here. I cannot see a future. I cannot see a future. And I find that's true with a lot of people who get really depressed. And there's physiological things going on, but what is happening in that moment is an ironclad certainty that the way things are right now is how they're always going to be. And that is a high anthropology kind of way of viewing the world. A low anthropology says, this is how things are. I can honestly say this is how things are. And yet I cannot know what the future may hold. It may get worse. But if past experience is any indication, it could also get better. I don't know. That's low anthropology, and that's a hopeful word for me. And I didn't really realize that. That was something I had to think through, because I didn't want the book to be a abstract sort of trip through other people's lives.
Yeah, no, I thought that point in particular was super insightful to me, that there's this tie between certainty and depression and high anthropology. I had never thought about before. So yeah, I thought that was great. I feel like it'll be helpful for a lot of people. Is there anything else that you kind of wish or want people to know about the book before they read it or look into it more? Anything that you hope that they would gain from it?
Well, sure. If someone picks it up thinking that it's me or engaging in sort of intra-Christian debates about human nature, Calvinists think this, Roman Catholics think this, and Presbyterians, or Lutherans think this, and Anglicans think this. Like, that's not, the book is, there's a section in there about semi-Pelagianism and selectively high anthropology when it comes to low anthropology and religion, which I think is really important, and it's true, and it could be received as a broadside against a certain type of legalism in Christianity. But if you're looking for that, it's not going to be. The book is trying to get, again, 4 or 5 steps back from that. And it's not doing that necessarily because I want to sell more copies, so that would be nice. It's doing it because I think the world needs this, and I need it. And I think that we've made it unintelligible to people by clothing everything in Christian terms. So Malcolm Muggeridge was a sort of a crotchety English Christian guy, like around sort of a little post C.S. Lewis, but a bit of a pundit for a while in England. And he would do something where he'd write a whole column and then just have one sentence at the end that would sort of point towards the gospel or towards Jesus. And I think that's more compelling, and I think that's more effective than if people are looking for me to like dot my I's and cross my T's and be extremely precise. And I'm not trying to communicate I'm trying to communicate what I think is the great heritage of my faith and what I draw upon to people that can't sort of get past the door in a lot of ways. Yeah. And so that's I guess the caution. Maybe it's an insecurity.
Yeah.
But it's hard.
Well, I think you're drawing a larger circle, which is needed, especially in a world where Christians are not, well, and specifically in America, Christianity is not dominant anymore. People lack belief. So I think that there is true beauty to that, and kind of gives people an open door to learn more. Basically what we're saying is, if you don't know what semi-Pelagianism means, you can still read this book. You can read it.
I'm not interested in just like talking to my same, I love my friends, and I'm glad we agree on certain things, but the world is out there hurting and huge amounts of despair, and let's draw the circle wider, because we've got something really wonderful good news to share that involves acknowledgement of the bad news. So also want it to be something that gets Christians excited about this amazing resource and tradition that they have to draw on. That's not that like secular people these days are better at using than Christians are. Like, so it's
Yeah, that's so true. Yeah, hopefully a good conversation starter for Christians to start thinking about how to dialogue with people about the human condition in a way that's gracious and, like you said, kind of is able to avoid those trigger points as much as possible. Is there, I know you're going to be kind of on the road in the next month or so. What should we be looking out for from you and from Mockingbird in particular this fall? What do you guys have going on?
I'll be at the 1517 conference in San Diego.
Great.
I can't wait.
Awesome.
I'll be on the road. There's a tour. If you go to mockingbird.com/Low Anthropology, you'll find about 100 dates, not 100, but like 30 dates. So I'll be in the Midwest, some Minneapolis. I'll be in New York. I'll be in Washington. I'll be in Tennessee, and I'll be in Texas. And I love travel. It's not always easy with little kids, but I do love it.
Yeah.
Mockingbird, we'll continue with our podcast, the Mockingcast, and continue to publish books and do all the various things that I think we've got a new issue of the magazine coming out called the Sleep Issue, about sleep, which I think is a really fascinating subject.
Yeah.
I'll be doing a gazillion podcasts for this though, and my life is sort of Low Anthropology, morning, noon, and night for the next little bit. Oh, we have a conference this fall in Tyler, Texas.
Okay.
And then it's a few weeks after the 1517, and then in January we've got one in Florida in Winter Park, which we thought was a good thing to do. And then in April, we'll be where you've spoken before. Kelsi will be back in New York the end of April, 27th to the 29th.
Okay.
Mockingbird NYC. Be there or be square.
Yes. It's so great. Hope everyone can go to the Mockingbird conference in the spring and Here We Still Stand in the fall. It's the best way to do it.
It is.
So Outside Ourselves is a 1517 podcast. To learn more and view all of our other podcasts, please go to 1517.org/podcasts. Also, did you know that our annual conference is called Here We Still Stand, is coming up in a couple of weeks. We've sold out of tickets. It's completely booked. But if you would still like to hear the speakers and be a part of the conference, you can do that because we have a free live stream available. If you want more information on the conference in general, the topics covered, the speakers, and where you can find that live stream, please go to our website, 1517.org. You're going to be able to find all of that information on our homepage. Thanks so much.